Hey, everybody out there joining in today. Happy Monday, I guess. No matter where you happen to be joining in from, this is Chris Torrence with another episode of the semi-related podcast hosted by Optum. Today, we have a special guest on. We've had this gentleman on in the past, but more in a panel format and a roundtable type discussion. And the thoughts were so good. We said let's see if we can get him back on there and on a one-on-one and get to know him a little better and some of the cool things he's working on. So know it's the holiday season, and we're talking offline about some of the if you're anything in like my organization, you're probably in those strategic planning discussions that are going on that typically take place this time of year. And I think our guest today will have some pretty cool insights for those, especially within the trucking and transportation realm, to really give some food for thought for those that may be involved in that process as we speak. So without further ado, welcome back, Chris Henry. How you doing, man?
Very good, very good. Thanks for having me back on. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
man. How's the holidays treating you so far?
Well, actually, we in Canada we celebrate, oddly enough, Thanksgiving at the early part of October.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
I got to celebrate two Thanksgivings. The second one, the American Thanksgiving, that allows me to get a lot of work done while my colleagues are off eating turkey. So
Yeah.
it was a nice reprieve for me.
So first question, you look great. You like you're maintaining a slim and trim fit figure. What is the secret, especially when you go through two Thanksgivings?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Just yeah, discipline, I guess, for lack.
Discipline, willpower.
Yeah,
Also, I got to call out the background there. I think is that a Hoosiers from
it
the
is.
original?
So that's a
That's
poster I
awesome.
got off Etsy probably about a decade ago. Hoosiers I've probably seen 300 times. I'm a big
Such a good
basketball
movie,
fan.
man.
So that one got my attention. It's probably my favorite piece of art.
Yeah, no, one of Gene Hackman for those of us that are at a certain age to know who he is.
Mhm.
One of my greatest films. I've
Absolutely.
actually had a family member text me from somewhere in Indianapolis today, or I'm sorry, this weekend, and they were kind of in a similar lineup where it was like a smaller school going up to play at the state level, and it was definitely like had Hoosiers written all over it. So I was like, just brought it back, and here we are today, and I'm seeing the poster. So
Yeah, and oddly enough, I was connected to Hoosiers way before I got hired by a Indianapolis-based company, but I actually have a number of colleagues who have personal connections to the movie itself. It came out right about that time where I was getting interested in basketball. So again, watched it 300 times, but there's a number of colleagues that have personal connections to whether it be the original team, cast members, the Knightstown gym
yeah,
where they filmed it. I've been there a couple times now. Yeah, it's just one of my favorite nostalgic movies.
yeah, I like I said, now you're making me want to find some streaming services offering. I'll watch it for my own 300th time. But
Yeah,
I coach younger kids now in soccer, not basketball. But that's got to be one of those movies. If I ever do time, if I'm coaching a basketball team, it's like just watch this movie that will teach you everything you need to know about basketball and life. Right? So very cool.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Chris, you mentioned you were in Indy for a while. I was like, I'm looking at your background is you've got such a pretty extensive background following your Amherst days. UMass, one of my best friends went to UMass Amherst, so give them a plug. But
Yeah.
when I look at all the various from going into the insurance up to some marketing, then it kind of pivoted over to of all things transportation and see you spent a little time with the TPP program by the TCA, a little time at Freight Waves. Um, got
Yeah.
some investment background. I mean, what hat haven't you worn is probably the real question. So
Well,
before you,
I guess the common theme, like right out of school, I was hired by an insurance agency, which evolved into a full uh, insurance company and MGA. But that company served the trucking industry, so that was my connection to trucking. And this was based in Canada. We grew that operation to from uh, fledgling would be overstating the situation. It was in trouble, and we grew it from basically 0% market share to over 50% market share of
wow,
the products that we served within transportation in a span of about 15 years. So I became a partner in that company. It was very successful, but my um, my my deep love was analytics, and
yeah,
through that business, I got connected to a lot of well-performing trucking companies, and I had always thought to myself, what if these companies could compare and contrast their performance against each other to make themselves better? So, with a partner of mine, Ray Haight, who used to be the chairman of TCA,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well as the one of the co-owners of a large Canadian trucking operation, we started a benchmarking software called StackUp back in 2014. So I left the insurance world, stayed in trucking, but focused on software. And we, over about 6 years, built that software platform into the really the only legitimate provider of truckload carrier benchmark data. We, during that time, through Ray's involvement with TCA, established a partnership with the Truckload Carriers Association, where we became the data provider of the what then was renamed to the TCA Profitability Program.
Yep.
So I was one of the forming managers getting that going, along with Jack Porter. And we then grew that program from about 44 companies to about 200 companies participating over that span of time. So that all culminated in selling that business and to Freightwaves
Hmm.
back in 2019. So I went to work for Freightwaves. So it's been a kind of a long, winding journey, but that didn't go as planned. They tended to focus more on the transactional side of the business, more on the shipper side. It
Yeah.
really wasn't a home for me. My allegiance is to carriers and helping them get better. A lot of my mentors are from trucking and truckload. So that brings me back to KSM. They've always been a trusted partner of mine back during my benchmarking days, and it was a no-brainer that I joined the team here.
Yeah, and I applaud you for wearing a few hats and get some exposure throughout various facets of the industry before getting into advising and consulting. And I think all too often I see, I get a lot of consultants reaching out and happen to know quite a few of them, right? Whether it's the big four accounting or even the McKenzies and the Bains and the BCGs of the world. But I always, and again, this is my subjective, right? I think very smart people did a lot better than me and academically, apparently. But when I look at people that have actually worn practitioner hats and had multiple vantage points throughout the industry, then and only then am I probably going to lean in to hear a little bit more what they have to say. So again,
Right.
kudos to you and anyone else out there that has taken on more of a role like Chris today, but has really walked a few miles in this industry and again had some exposure from different lenses to be able to say that I've seen a lot. And I think that's just one of the rare occurrences I see with just consulting in general without having that deep level of expertise that you've gained.
Yeah, and I think the one thing to add to that is really I've always liked being not necessarily the expert, but more the conduit to the
Yeah.
right information. So whether it be benchmarking data or best practices, I've always enjoyed connecting people with the right source, whether it be
Right.
a physical connection. Hey, let me introduce you to this person. They know about this product or service or model, or this is where you should be based on this data that we have available to us. So I'm not the expert, but I can find them very quickly.
I think that's good. The self awareness, right, and just have that cognizant ability to say, I can be a matchmaker.
Yeah.
I fall in that same category. I think I like to. I'm a connector of people, right, and I think that's complements not only my personal reputation as not the know it all ever. I often say I'm rarely, if ever, the smartest guy in any room, but I always
Right.
seem to know the right people or the right room to get involved with. So I'm going to learn something, and like I said, if anything, it may not be an opportunity for me in the business sense, but it's a connection made that always comes full circle and pays itself forward. And I got to imagine, Chris, over the course of your career, that same mentality has gotten you where you're at today. So
Yeah, I'm very grateful for where I am today and the connections I've made, and the connections have gotten together in different ways, whether it be transactions where one company became part of another company, or friendships have occurred, lifelong friendships. So it's been a great ride so far.
yeah. Well, let me go back a bit because I know you mentioned the analytics and just the importance that analytics plays. As someone who's sat at shipper, big fortune company shippers, since in my time anyway, that was always top of mind. These are folks that big corporations, they pay the freight bills. Oftentimes, transportation was viewed as that cost center. I think, unfortunately, that's still somewhat pervasive, although I think it is changing. But when did you remember the moment, maybe earlier in your career, where this idea of like, what about the carriers, right? It is that symbiotic relationship between both sides of the coin from shippers, and I'll put carriers in a slightly different category than maybe 3PLs and brokers, but still the LSPs, if you will. Do you remember like what around what time, or what was the catalyst when you started to realize, hey, carriers are, they're moving, they are interested to see, what is our operating ratio, what could we be doing better? And I'm just curious because I think a lot of people listening are like, only in the last few years do they even associate analytics and trucking in the same sentence, and maybe I'm wrong.
No, you're completely right, and I think it's really due to um, the resources that are available based on the margins that are the reality in trucking. So, kind of going back, I've always been connected to the carrier side, whether it be in the insurance world, benchmarking, and now on the profit analysis side with KSM. So I've got to see firsthand, what these companies have to do to make a profit.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about the general ledger. We're talking about the operations, the safety, all the risks and stresses that they have to deal with to eke out a marginal at best margin, for lack of a better term. So I've always had that connection, and there has been a lack of available resources and kind of group knowledge on what is acceptable from a operational basis, whether it be revenue per truck per week,
Yeah.
margin per truck per week, all the statistics you can think of. There hasn't been one common model to say this is what is acceptable and that kind of thing. So I've always felt that, and that's kind of guided my career and KSM, is we can be that. We can provide that kind of information so that we set new goals as an industry for what is acceptable from a margin perspective. So when you compare the current risk-free rate of return in the U.S. and Canada, and what companies right now are getting, there's a huge disconnect. Trucking companies are getting right now. So most companies are generating an operating loss right now. That's the reality
Yeah.
in the trucking world, and has been for at least the last 18, if not 24 months. So when you connect that to 3, 4, 5% risk-free or very low risk rate of return, that's got to be frustrating to the typical trucking company owner. So we believe there needs to be group think, group activity to improve that. And there's lots of providers on the shipper side because of the monies that are available to
Great.
shippers to assist them. So we think the same should be true for carrier, and that's what we're working the carrier side, and that's what we're working towards.
Yeah, and when I think about it, there's so many metrics. You just outlined quite a few, and probably things most people don't think about because you're incorporating every facet of that, right? The profitability, just we're to no secret that it's been a pretty razor thin margin and industry at large for
Mm-hmm.
many years.
Yeah.
Do you? When I talk to there's this mindset, that the one metric, the OR, right, that operating ratio is pretty indicative of how the rest of the organization is probably running from a business standpoint. And
Yeah.
you see that number fluctuate. And you see some companies do it better than others, and obviously market conditions, for better or worse, tend to have an impact as well.
Mm-hmm.
What in order like what do you think constitutes? And you mentioned it, but if I'm someone who's sitting here and we talk about earlier off camera, this is a time of year where a lot of people are starting to do years of reflection, of the previous this year 2024, and hopefully looking into ways that they can improve going into the next 2025. And again, market conditions are just that. But when I think it's almost oversimplified that, our OR is okay, it looks okay, therefore everything else must be running smoothly. But I'm sure when you really like peel that back, you're probably uncovering a lot of areas that will ultimately impact that OR. But what are a lot of companies you engage with missing when they just speak in a broad operating ratio sense?
Um, well, I think going back to what you said earlier in this segment here about self-reflection, the companies that come to us, they're already skewed towards that. They want to get better. So we kind of have we don't have a perfect sense on what the average carrier is doing because we're getting the ones that want to do better. But in general terms, I think being able to um, self-reflect is the number one thing, and be judgmental, be open to suggestion. So in our series that we published in 2023 called the 12 Traits of Highly Profitable Trucking Companies, one of the key things was being a humble leader. And that didn't
Yeah.
mean necessarily being the trucking company owner, but could be the just a fleet manager. They're leading a group of drivers. So being able to be open to different thought processes and ways of looking at the business is what we see as kind of a common thread of highly profitable trucking companies, and the clients that we work with. But the OR on its own, there's things that can hide a good OR. For example, you may have really strong performance on the maintenance side, but that's hiding, poor performance on specific lanes with specific customers. So if you don't get down to the granular lane by lane, load by load, uh, you know, incidents on the insurance side, accidents on the insurance side, your inventory turn on the maintenance side, you have to get to the granular and know the benchmarks for what is acceptable for each of those based on the attributes of your company, length of haul, operating region for compensation, those kind of things. So if you don't have those benchmarks and you're not willing to get outside opinion, I don't, with few exceptions that I've seen, you don't have a long time in this industry.
I couldn't agree more. We've seen that historically time and time again.
Yeah.
Another interesting topic is, you talk about you mentioned some of the soft skills and that humility, that humbleness. You mentioned the benchmarking model. That's been, again, not benchmarking in general. Is always been a great way, a litmus test of, how am I performing relative to my peers or my competition? And I often feel like there's a want that's overtly expressed in the meetings I've had in these types of conversations, but it's almost like there's still this inherent trust factor of how much I'm willing to share. And even you're like, well, it'll be anonymized. There's ways we're not trying to expose your secret sauce here, but I always find it's this reconciliation process of I want to be in part of this consortium or this benchmarking, an indice of sorts, but I'm a little hesitant to really share probably some of those data requirements. How do you kind of overcome that when you're engaging with anyone that may be a little bit more reserved of being, willing to participate in these benchmarking?
Yeah. So in a market like ours where there's almost no barriers to entry, no legitimate barriers to entry, you know, there's no competitive advantage, disadvantage, or competitive advantage of not, participating in some form of benchmarking, whether it be ATRI's annual survey or
Mm-hmm.
some other activity. But the quote that keeps coming to mind when I hear something like that is Brent Nussbaum, who's the CEO of Nussbaum Transportation,
Mm-hmm.
well regarded as one of the top performing top companies to work for. He's always stated, and his actions line up with his words, is a educated competitor is a better competitor for the industry. So how I translate, I'm not going to paraphrase him, but how I translate that is once you communicate with your peers how you're performing, and they as a byproduct get to see how they're performing versus their peers, they will be able to set a new threshold for what's acceptable or not. And by doing that, all boats rise,
Right.
and their margins should, what they feel is an acceptable margin should improve once they see what's out there. But it doesn't just stop, at the OR or the net margin. They can look at productivity measures. They can look at specific loads on specific lanes. So not just knowing what your rate per mile is and what you're making on a one-way basis, but overall how it's accruing profit relative to the network.
Right.
So our practice focuses on ad hoc, over the road truckload companies. We're not we're not too much focused on the dedicated side because that's a little bit more simple
Model.
arithmetic.
Yeah.
But you need to be able to go, a mile wide, and then if you need it, a mile deep in any category. And that's kind of what underlies our long-term strategy. So we're not looking at, okay, predictive analytics and decision automation like what you guys do. We're more looking at what does the ledger say post doing it,
Right.
and sometimes they don't line up with what a carrier decided or a group of people decided, but it leaves trails to modify their decisions going forward.
Yeah. I think people, again, I alluded to this earlier, people just really drastically underestimate the amount of data points when you talk about transportation because the general population, you're moving stuff from A to B, they see trucks on the road. How complex is it? And I think it takes someone like you or the KSMs of the world to be able to really go, well, this is the tip of the iceberg that you see. It is such a massive undertaking. And there's so much data. So, Chris, when you think about again the evolution of your time in the industry, and maybe this kind of ties in a little the technology and analytics that I think were really effectively non-existent, not so long ago.
Yeah.
Um, what are some data points in your engagements that maybe are often overlooked that may start, you mentioned the predictive piece and all that. I get a lot of that. But the reality is the numbers don't lie, as the saying goes, right? And I think a lot of the executives I deal with have these grandiose visions of being able to somehow, get ahead of it through this predictive or using AI or something like that. And at the end of the day, like, how do you, when you go into these, do you just kind of start and go, look, here's reality. Like, this is your historical data. And instead of us trying to, like, go after all these bleeding edge technologies thinking that's the silver bullet, how do you translate their desire to go be on the cutting edge of technology with the reality of you are not there yet? How does that get interpreted when you have to give them that, that dose of reality?
Yeah, and I'll highlight one specific set of data elements. We call it chronology. So it's time.
Yeah.
So in our profit model, we call freight math. One of the key elements and the denominator in all of our margin calculations is time. So the accuracy of time data, even with high performing trucking companies, is pretty um, bleak. I don't
Yeah.
trying to think of a better word, but it's not good. So when carriers start with us, and most of them are using, you know, um, what I call legitimate TMSs with good business logic. Despite that, there's always been ways to get around the system, workarounds to make something else happen on the operation side. And as a result, you have bad chronology data. So you have poor continuity. So, I'm talking about, the old AS400 type TMSs that are, widely in use, innovative and TL2000 type
Hmm.
TMSs. So with a lot of clients, the first 8 weeks, most of it is really spent on quality control. But once you have the logic locked down to the best you can with the telematics you have and the capabilities and the resources you have, then you can start getting, useful information. But until that time, it's very uncommon for a carrier to get, right off the bat, just,
Yeah.
you know, a 99% score of 100. That is from a data accuracy perspective. So uh, chronology data is something that's evolved over the last 10 years. In my old benchmarking days, we only would have maybe three or four carriers that could legitimately provide, revenue per hour, per margin per hour, driver comp per hour data. And this was from a very well-respected group of carriers. But now that's changed, but there's still a lot of work to be done in that regard.
And you touched on this. I love the last time we spoke on the panel. You mentioned freight math, which may be trademarked by KSM now. Kind of keep it simple,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I think you guys are just if I'm not mistaken, in October-ish, I think you guys just revamped or the 2.0 versions out. For those that may not be familiar with that, just kind of getting a little deeper on some of the enhancements that you made since the initial generation of freight math, the concept, to where it is today under 2.0. What's most exciting about that? And for folks listening in that want to kind of maybe get with you afterwards, what can they expect to get out of that?
Yeah, so it wouldn't be earth shattering if you're not already a client, but up until this point, over the last 15 years, we've utilized the legacy software platform to calculate the values, basically the underlying values, and then the work product or the output for what's now called freight math. It is a network-based profitability analysis that can be drilled down to the load level. But what it really does, it calculates whether that load added profit to the network or did it remove profit from the network. So the biggest change with this Freight Math 2.0 model is migrating to a modern data infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So we use the combination of both Azure Cloud as well as Snowflake for that infrastructure. And that has dramatically changed the way and the tools and analytics we can provide our clients. So I'll give you an example. You're a trucking company and you want to buy another trucking company and you want to engage us to understand how your network from a margin, from a volume perspective connects to this other one. In the past, that would probably take us 45 days to get the data and do the work and press the buttons and all that kind of jazz. Now, within 48 hours, we can provide our analysis. So there's a direct benefit to the client in terms of speed at which they get the
Yeah.
data, but more important, it's more accurate than it was before. There's less head fakes. It sets us up to build new tools that we haven't done in the past that we're working on in the future. One is a bid warehouse for our carrier clients. This is our again carrier centric analytics and other tools, tactical tools that they can use to get better. But it's really a behind the scenes thing that we've done. We invested and worked on the last 3 years to get across the finish line in September, and it's such a dramatic change internally for us.
Yeah, I was kind of browsing a little bit, learning more about the just those different profit levers of for
Mm-hmm.
the 2.0 version, and key subjects around the density, right, is a key
Yep.
driver. The You mentioned, I think, surgical pricing, and then of course we got to get into the operational alignment, and then there's of course the sales forces that need to be a little more targeted in their own strategies.
Yep.
All these things tie in, and I just think again there's so much opportunity, and I applaud KSM yourself for kind of taking just continuing to evolve that. One of the things, go ahead, Chris. You may have
No,
some.
no, no.
I covered a lot of areas right there,
Nothing
so
to
I
add.
think
Yeah, it's that
let's just stay on the density side, right? So you hear this density and liquidity. I hear these terms, right? They're and they make sense. I mean, but I think when you get down to how does that translate into the operational world? How do you go and engage companies that may have a national footprint? You've done your analysis and you're seeing, hey, there's areas that we are not as strong in. So is your recommendation is it a kind of I don't want to oversimplify this, but as a core strategy, do you feel like it's with that density mindset? Do you like the idea of having a high dense area and then incrementally expanding beyond that? Or depending on the footprint and the network of some of your customers, is that possible to do in parallel across multiple regions? Or is it just, you mentioned the M&A piece, maybe that's another one when you're involved in those. You mentioned the Tenny Group, who's
Mhm.
shout out to Spencer.
Mhm.
Those are folks I'm guessing that are complementary, doing things that parallel with what you guys are doing on the analytics side to be able to really express to those potential buyers and sellers as well, hey, this is how this M&A would overlap. But going back to the density piece, is that something that companies are saying, well, we could organically try to do it ourselves, or we could acquire a company that we're South or West region, they have a high presence in the mighty Northeast. Are those things that you may derive and going, well, here's what it would cost you to try to incrementally get that organically versus, hey, here's a company that you may want to keep an eye on to get, assuming that M&A were to go well, to kind of get you there faster?
Yeah, it really is more of in most cases, an organic recommendation list. And the we do get involved in acquisitions, but those are typically at the behest of a buyer,
Yeah.
most typically a buyer that's not engaged with us today. But with our existing clients, the connection with density is that we've done studies with our client data to do correlations of uh, density within a given area or set of areas and overall profitability. And without fail, the more dense a carrier's network, and I'll define that in a second, there is a direct correlation to higher profitability. So with us, it's not necessarily adjacent markets like North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, etc. It is the number of areas relative to the freight that you have in a given 4-week, 12-week period. So the more dense you are going in and out of these geographic market areas, so our market areas are similar to like DAT's market
Yeah.
areas. There's some change, carve outs that we've made, but that is our focus from a density perspective, is try to do more within the footprint that you already have, or cut out some of these areas. So we have different visualizations to guide them in that process, and one of them is an areas of profit map. So every week it gets refreshed, and there's going to be areas that are color coded based on their density. So the deeper the saturation, the more
Right.
the volume in or out. And then there's all these outlying gray areas. So we call those areas of insignificant volume. So we have to come up with a better term for that, but it describes exactly what it is you don't go there very often, and when you do, you may or may not make a profit, but you can't count on it.
Right.
So typically what is happening there is either they're taking a flyer on a load that was offered to them that had good one-way profitability, but more often than not, it's making them jump through hoops to get back into their core network, or they're getting a driver home that lives outside the network, and that's where our freight math model extends beyond operations and the finance team. It gets to the business development, but the recruiting team in this case, and say, okay, if it's an outlying area that we don't have any volume going in or out, I don't care what you say, don't recruit out of there.
Yeah.
And so now our clients are saying to the recruiters, don't bring me someone that lives outside area. I don't care how long they said they're going to stay out for, whether it be, 2 weeks or 2 years, don't do it. And companies are benefiting because of that. You have to figure out in this market any way that you can conserve margin. And recruiting outside your network is typically, not always, but typically a good way to just burn money.
I like how you kind of use the power lane and delineate it from a spider lane. I like those terms too, because it kind of visually helps represent that. So I think I saw. I don't know if you coined that, but I like that. Kind of makes it easy, and I think those are terms used within the industry a little
Yeah, we think we coined it, but it looks like Schneider's using it now, at least the power lane term, but we'll wait for the credit on that one. But so the spider lanes are basically the lanes of least density, if that's an appropriate
bit. Yeah.
framework. So basically, what's happened over the last 2 years, um, carriers have been reluctant to give up tractors so that they can leverage when the market goes up. So they've leveraged themselves financially in order to wait for that to happen, and it hasn't happened. So what most companies have done is they've gotten more disenfranchised from their network. So they're going to areas of low volume, which translates into these spider lanes.
Yeah.
So really, it's the same kind of exercise as what we're advising our clients, is to limit the areas of low volume, but also limit the lanes, unique origin destination pairs of low volume. And as a byproduct, you're subtracting and adding at the same time. You're doing less of it. So, as long as you have some freight that can keep the driver moving, you're probably better off for it. And, we get pushback on this. Well, the drivers like to, stretch your legs. And we just say, that's not what you pay us for. You pay us to tell you the obvious things that are harming your network, whether it be a customer, a lane for a customer, or other things. But It's all math to us, and
Yeah.
whether you like it or not is we're agnostic.
Yeah. You mentioned the strategic sales. That kind of ties me in. It's interesting because the way that people are incentivized, right? Some are incentivized by a complete opposite, diametrically opposed incentive than others. I gotta
Mhm.
imagine though, when you go into these organizations, as data driven as it is, and it's very math, math heavy. Whether it's a
Mhm.
recruiter looking to recruit in different domicile locations or a sales force that's out there, they're incentivized to get their numbers right, which could be just increasing the amount of drivers, the retention of those drivers. Then you got sales guys that are saying, they're going to find it if they find a shipper or inbound, outbound, whatever you want to call it, that they deem in their own minds as that's a sale I'm going to go after. Is there a little challenge from the operations and sales, right? The age old little debate there about
Yeah.
hey, I know you want to close some business for your own commission, but you're really looking at it through a pretty selfish lens. And at the end, as KSM would produce, like the math doesn't work out. So how do you bridge those gaps between those that are incentivized based on a metric that has ultimately a detrimental impact to the network as a whole?
Yeah, so it's really more of a cultural thing,
Yeah.
and you can kind of feel that right from the get-go with companies. So you can kind of predict how it's going to go when you bring the business development people into the loop. So the ones with good cultures where they're all on the same team and they're marching the same beat, they have the right incentives in place. They're like, perfect. I need this extra information. So for us, that looks like, okay, you know, here's the areas that were imbalanced, which isn't rocket science. Any carrier can do it. But more importantly, you know, which areas need better performing freight? Where do you need to replace brokers at higher performing margins? So not only get balance, but also get higher performing freight and tie incentives back. So I think it's refreshing for a lot of business development people because they get a targeted action list as opposed to, find me more loads. So instead of saying, sign up craft or whatever, um, you know, look at these 10 RFPs and see if we can locate, these 40 lanes where we really desire more freight we need to replace broker freight with. So on the flip side, where they don't embrace the model, the culture's, substandard from that perspective. We have to be the ones to say, okay, if you don't get it, this is math. Again, it doesn't matter. It's math. It's, eliminate the emotion. They may need to find another home,
Yeah.
and or the company needs to put in place the right incentives to drive the right behaviors.
Yes.
But yeah, we've seen lots of both in our dealings.
Yeah, it's interesting. What strikes me as somewhat unique is oftentimes is that my tech vendor years we go in and do optimization, which requires an immense amount of data.
Right.
We'll go to these on sites and try to ask for everybody that's oversees a function to sit together in a room.
Mm-hmm.
These are folks that are traditionally divided by a lot of walls within their own internal offices that rarely communicate when it comes to exactly these. We're looking at a very holistic and a very objective viewing of our company. And I
Right.
often just go like, it's just surreal to me that in those meetings, some tech vendor coming here and asking for this is maybe the first time they've all sat in a room together. And it's just amazing to witness how many, like, even internally it's like, well, I didn't know that. I didn't realize we were doing that. So it's almost like that there's an opportunity there for organizations to break those silos down internally, functionally, and work more together cross functionally. I think what I notice is they get so tied up in their own little lens of what they've got to do today when I log in to log out, and the way the nature of this industry, transportation, is just a continuum of movement. It's like rarely they feel like we have to step back and really evaluate, like, are we doing the right thing? And I think it takes folks like KSM and maybe tech vendors to be able to really bring that to light. So just
Yeah.
observation.
No, it's very easy in any business, but most specifically trucking, to get caught up in the day to day. So the fires that are constantly occurring, there's no shortage of those. So you can always find yourself busy, whatever role you're in a trucking operation. But with all that being said, shame on some carriers because they haven't made data available. Some have the data and produce in a method that people can leverage, or those that simply haven't engaged someone like us or another vendor to make that data available to their people. They, it is pervasive, this thought that only the people at the top can really action data. And we've seen the complete opposite. So we have tools that really are in the domain of only the frontline people. And those frontline people are spotting things every day that are making a $50 improvement on a load or a $100 improvement, and they all compound over time. Right? So, the number one trait of high performing companies and the ones that we use as role models for that series, they know who they are. Um, they put transparency front and center. We're all on the same team. Profit has to come first before we can do any of the other good stuff. So what do you guys got for us? Let's figure this out. And then they have ways to manage all that information and feedback and that kind of stuff. But no, I well stated. Sometimes you need an outside party to bring it up, and uh, people can be consultant skeptical. I used that term last week with a large multinational shipper that we're engaged with on a company that they purchased, a trucking company they purchased. And so I get that, but our model is so focused that, again, it eliminates the emotion and should eliminate the skepticism.
Yeah, well said. I applaud any organization that brings in frontline workers and operations planners, dispatchers into these conversations, because it's amazing the disconnect at the boardroom
Yeah.
versus what's going on the operational floor. So I think for anyone listening, going this, and Chris would probably echo this, like, do not look at this as the executive that probably has minimal line of sight into the nuances that these folks see out on the floor day to day. And it's just enlightening. And I often say, whether you've been here 17 years or 7 weeks, there's always a perspective that can be offered by a different vantage point of someone who's doesn't have that leather seat in the boardroom, but that's actually who I want to talk to more than anyone, because that's who's going to be using the products that I sell.
And probably maybe one of the most important points in that regard is they're frontline people now, but that process of being transparent, it allows you to identify your high potential people. So in our business, we use this 9 box model that connects performance and potential. And with those non-transparent situations, they don't get the ability to do that because, again, they're not exposing their people to what the world is, outside of the role. And what ends up happening is they just leave. They find a new home for their ambition and their ideas and their desires. And shame on those companies that don't embrace it.
Yeah. Well said. I see it time and time again, and I hope my message at some point sticks. But you nailed it, Chris. It's culture goes back to, can't tell you how many executives I know throughout the industry that within a few years of retirement. So whether it's embracing new technology and evolving that perspective, or just a willingness to hear out folks that they deem as rookies and what do they know, right?
Yeah.
I think in those engagements, you nailed it, right? You find out that pretty quick when you're on your initial discovery type scenario, and it's like, here we go again, right? Like,
Yeah, we don't have any clients like this, but I've encountered many trucking company owners over the years that start off conversations with talking in the third person. Well, Jim Smith does it this way, and you lose me every time. And I have no desire to work with people and companies like that.
yeah. Chris, kind of switching gears, you mentioned the data piece, right? Because you are a data driven company. It is a lot of mathematics, numerics. Do you feel that the industry, from where it was back in your earlier years to now, do you feel like we've gotten better at the ability to capture data, and just the access to it, right? I think you often hear like all these new vendors, point solutions are coming up, which is great, but then the big I word, right? The integration. And I feel like that's just something that on the surface, I like to think it's getting better. But on some level, I feel like there's just at a master data level, like MDM, right? There's often, and I go back to my shipper years where we would do these we'd be in the middle of a bid or a procurement event, and have a consultant come in and say, get all this information. We look at it and go, we have so much redundant information. It's really going to even be difficult to extract any kind of trends here. And I think I'm like, it's like spring cleaning. I always say, it's like, we know we need to do it, but like no one wants to even volunteer for that undertaking because it seems insurmountable to get data. And then
Yeah,
I kind of raise it further. You go into an industry, a lot of industries, maybe there's more regulation involved, but we have like, there is no commonality in a lot of the times how we even define data. So when
yeah,
you're going to these exercises and you're asking for these disparate sources of data to try to tell a compelling story, you've got to be able to piece that together. So again, do you feel like, are we getting better, or do you have any best practices to share about how to make that a smoother process that doesn't seem so painful that right away they're like, I don't even want to go down this road. Thanks for coming in, and we'll let you know, right?
yeah. Well, going back to, you know, basically 10 years ago, 10, almost 11 years ago, when I first started doing the benchmarking, I can say without question that companies, carriers have become more sophisticated from a data perspective. That has been driven by their own work, but also due to the sophistication of the vendors that they choose. So, everyone knows there's been a pretty massive evolution on the telematics side. So you had these, bulwarks, the stalwarts that were always there, the initial ones that, got all the business and they failed to invest in their businesses. And, some of the newer telematics providers ate their lunch. So a lot of carriers have benefited from that. And by nature of having more accurate telematics tools, the data that's being put into the TMSs are becoming more accurate, especially for us, safety situations, those kind of things. The frustrating thing is TMSs, I'm not going to say everyone, but a lot of them feel they're also the gatekeepers of the data. So they kind of look down upon the carrier and say, okay, we have this data, but you're not ready to work with it. Well, that's not their job. They need to provide open APIs for companies, their clients, that they can then permission to third-party vendors, and then just reduce the friction that's available. So I see that as more the last, you know, issue is that TMS barrier to entry, and then also obviously companies not using modern TMS providers
Got it.
just due to the cost. But overall, getting better, but more ways, more work to be done in
Will
that area.
work. Well, we haven't really talked about this whole AI. I think they're calling it. I don't know if you've heard of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Sounds like it's promising. Sounds like maybe it's been overpromised. When you're engaging now, Chris, I got to imagine, analytics is a huge driver in this, but naturally there's an appetite now to go, well, how do we start to augment and automate as we have data flowing in? Do you think that how do you address that AI question for those your clients that are looking going, I'm sure it comes up, right? Well, Chris, how are we looking at this today? How are we looking at it in a couple of years or down the road? What are your general thoughts on how AI, and I know it's a broad stroke, right? So relative to asset-based trucking, where do you
Mm-hmm.
see the best use cases of AI and other automation tools fitting in today? And where do you see the potential of it going in years to come?
Uh, Really, from a area, there's no area in the business is going to be remain untouched by AI within the next decade, if not sooner. So we're big believers in AI. KSM's big believers in AI overall. We're users on an enterprise basis of AI for our workflow and soon to be for some of our recommendations and analytics. So fully embrace it. Um, this is a topic that I've had many discussions with our clients with, as well as participants in our Trucking Analytics Council, which meets every 2 years, or sorry, twice a year, each year. We had one meeting fully focused this year on AI, and basically, you know, we did a group study where we gave them a topic and they said, okay, now figure out how this applies to AI and then come back with the recommendations. So there was machine learning projects, there was a AI study based on combining, safety and productivity from a driver perspective and learnings from that. But it could be contractual stuff. So my daughter wants to become a lawyer, and I'm just trying to, even though she's going to become a lawyer, trying to push her towards the AI world to give her a full wide picture of what that world is going to look like in 5, 10 years. So, what you would have paid, $10,000 for a contract, or 20 or 30 or 40,000, that's not going to be the case. So lawyers have to find new sources of revenue in that regard. So, decision automation tools. So the planning role is going to look much different,
Yeah.
as you can attest, than it did 10, 15 years ago. So it's every part of the business is going to evolve, and the TMS providers have to embrace the idea of not being the gatekeepers, letting that AI flow to the data.
Yeah. On the inverse, what isn't AI or machines? What do you think in your experience, and again looking in through a forward-looking perspective, what won't AI be able to fix, right? Or solve, or we can say it'll assist to some level, but you think about the world we live in, and again we'll keep it in the context. Law is one thing, transportation's a completely different a segment. What won't it be able to do well?
Honestly, I don't know. Like, I wish I was a little bit closer to retirement so I didn't feel so paranoid, but I'm not. But I'll use another example. My son phoned the bank because I don't know, there was some transaction he was dealing with, and he was talking to, and he didn't know it at the time, an AI avatar or whatever you persona, and natural language. They
Yeah,
inserted the natural ums and ahs.
it's
He
crazy.
had, he didn't know until the end of the conversation when they disclaimed that this was generated by AI. Are we allowed to use this for training data? And he was just blown away. So the last bastion, what I thought would be that interaction with the driver themselves, but we're already seeing
Yeah.
some carriers automating this with chatbots, as well as um, the audio based
Hmm.
chatbots, for lack of a better term. So I'm at a loss to really say that nothing's really going to be touched by AI. So the drivers, I think, are in the safest position compared to anything else.
I'm with you. I think the autonomous trucks and just vehicles in general, they're making strides, but I often say
Yeah,
like I remember 10 years ago when a lot of this was starting to really surface, and we assume fast forward to 2024 where we are now, there'd be nothing but driverless trucks out on the road, and that would just be the new norm. And we're obviously not there. And I think
no,
just the sheer amount of capital it takes for that type of technology, if it's the right technology, um, it's interesting. But I feel like again, you're right. I think at the end of the day, if there's one human aspect that's still going to be in the equation for I think quite a few years to come, it's that human driver, right? So
no,
I hope that any driver that's for the recruiters that you work with, go, how do I tell a driver that you should come, take this choice as a career path? And they're going to, the younger generation, like, well, how long is that going to last before I'm at the truck? I
yeah,
don't have the answer, but in my personal view, it's going to be quite some time, because I
it's
think
going
it's,
to be quite
again,
some time.
the amount of public trust, and then we talk about legislative and regulatory hurdles and safety. It's just a lot, right? So I think that for those listening that may be looking at a driver, which is a great life for those that are in a position to kind of say this is a great way to make some good money and see a lot of the country, otherwise you may not able to. Please don't look at AI as an immediate threat to that. And as Chris and I have just said, what won't AI possibly replace in years to come? And that's a more existential question. But
It
going back
is.
to the trucking industry we play in, I still feel like, as every technology we've all run across, like it's going to take a lot longer to really hit scale with any meaningful value than we ever anticipate when the technology is making all the headlines, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely.
well, Chris, going into, like I said, I've had you for about an hour, man. I kind of let's look into 2025.
Mhm.
We I've been at the conference circuit. All the questions. Some have touted the recession is over, the freight recession. We're at new beginning. I think I see some articles today that it's been a very muted peak season, if you will, considering it's Q4 holidays.
Yeah.
I won't say big, bold predictions from you, but anything that you feel that going into next year is something that again, no right or wrong answer. Any predictions along those lines? Could be anything.
Yeah, and in this area, this discussion topic, I tend to be the optimist. I was the optimist last year, and it didn't prove to be true. So any confidence you have in my predictions, just put them
I'm
on
in
the
the
shelf.
same boat, man.
Yeah,
That's why I ask and don't answer that question.
but what I can say, because each week we're processing 4 weeks of transactional load level data, we're seeing some slight upticks in each of the modes that we operate in with those 65 companies that are mixed up between van, reefer, flatbed, kind of like a 40, 30, 30 kind of split. So we're starting to see some upticks in their margins overall. So that's probably driven by a little bit of a capacity reduction on the spot market side. So backhaul loads are assisting them now, finally. Um, and on the flatbed side, we're starting to hear some clients getting, some small but actual increases. They haven't seen those in a long time.
Yeah.
So that's good. And the biggest tell, kind of like a poker deal that I see, is we have multiple reports of shippers trying to lock carriers in for 3 years. One mentioned 5 years on rates. So
Sure.
that's kind of like the biggest kind of subjective one that's out there. But the same thing happened right prior to the upswing, was trying to lock these guys down, and so I think that bodes well for 2025. My counterpart David, who's our CEO, our president of KSM Transfer Advisors, he's a little bit more skeptical. He's leaning towards more the middle to end of 2025 for real recovery. But
Yeah.
um, it's been a long time for these carriers, and many companies are just hanging on by the bare threads.
Do you
So
think we'll see more, Chris, go like at the headlines just not fully evolved to the amount of folks that actually held on to some of that COVID boom time money, and now it's kind of like are they starting to run out of gas? And do you suspect Q1 could be some unfortunate news, or maybe that opens up for M&A too? Like you see a lot of that going on.
yeah, so you see some of these, companies that are publicly traded, that lending companies that are publicly traded, that have exposure to the transportation
Yeah.
industry, and you read the footnotes or the press headlines, and you see write-downs. Whenever you see write-downs, that means that they're going to take action in that quarter, the next quarter. It's
Yeah.
not that they've taken action; it's they're getting in front of
Imminent.
it.
Yeah.
So yeah, unfortunately, you're going to see people go under, but a lot of the people that you see go under, they, prior to COVID, if they were around, it just delayed the inevitable.
Yeah.
But then there's also those that just, didn't manage their capital needs the way they should. They had turnover at the top. Those are the ones where I really feel where, long-standing, well-respected carriers that just hit a bad patch or
Mhm.
lost a big client. Those are the ones I really feel for, because otherwise they would be, in good standing.
Well, listen, I can't, again, coming in at our time today, Chris,
Mhm.
obviously appreciate it. I can't, I think all this really in my mind, it tells a story, just the various topics we touched of. If it's not, if you're a truckload carrier operation, this resonates with you. I gotta, that your core competency may be trucking, but I think as we've touched on, there's so many other facets to how a successful organization runs. And you mentioned 60, 70 clients that you're working with today. I assume all of them have improved. And
Yeah.
I'm hopeful that others that may have been kind of on the fence about bringing some external perspective that has, a true expertise in understanding the numbers, the freight math mindset, right? We touched on a lot of the subsets within that. I hope they're more receptive. I know budgets are tight, but I think there's this fallacy of, I can spend this money and go buy a new truck that may sit idle and depreciate. Or, hey, here's an idea. How about bringing in some smart people that can tell you that there may be a gold mine under the fleet you already have, and you're underutilizing it, and there's a lot of decisions that you've made historically that were you to take a different stance and again have some empirical data to back it up through guys like Chris, that may be a good investment of your time and whatever financial allocation that may entail. So again, hopeful people are receptive to just saying, hey, let me get an outsider's perspective for the first time maybe ever, right? And someone who's, again, as I said earlier, is not one of the other, the vanilla consulting companies that inevitably these companies hire because of their brand. And what do, Chris? They call me or they call you to find out what's actually going on and just bypass that, right? Go to the guys that have been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years, right?
I promise if you reach out to us, we're not going to respond and just tell you more revenue, lower cost. That's not
The
our model.
obvious, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's pure math. It's not a black box. You can get back to the underlying numbers, and more carriers, which is positive to see, are willing to, based on our last quarter, are willing to get a second opinion. But I encourage more to do so, whether it's us or your company or anyone else. Now's the time. You don't want to have your hand forced where your lender's telling you, okay, you need to engage this company
Right.
that doesn't understand trucking or doesn't understand, the world you live in. So
Right.
be proactive in everything you do.
And I think I'm going to touch on this real quick. In a deflationary freight recession, whatever we want to call the last 2.5 years, often get in a lot of tech vendors and other solutions providers, like, and even in your world as well, it's, we just don't have budget. But it's the irony strikes me is as soon as this market inevitably flips and you're not up to par with your competitors on being able to, understand the data, the analytics, and make ultimately that translates into making better operational, tactical decisions at every level. Like, I just think that's going to be a rude awakening. And we're
Yeah,
going to see it that those companies that did take this pause in a down market and made those investments are going to be at they're going to be at a level that I think that those that haven't are going to it's going to be realized fairly quickly because, and again, there's a lot of moving parts there, but I don't say we have a little bias here, but again, as Chris said earlier, like the rising tide lifts all boats. Like I hope the industry as a whole starts to really kind of embrace some of these newer ideas and folks like Chris Henry here that are the objective is to help you, right? That is it. There is no ulterior motive here. It's because when you win and your client base wins, that starts to there's a network effect there that can just produce some amazing results that may have otherwise just never been noticed. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Chris, I appreciate the time again, man. I know in the new year, I hope to see you. I don't know if you and I have really connected too much in person.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hopeful that I'm going to enjoy my break from a extensive conference season, fall, spring, etc. But I
Sure.
assure you, Jacob, our marketing guys already got me lined up for many more next year. So hope to see you out there. And if there's anything I can do for you in the meantime, please don't hesitate to ask.
Yeah, no, and thank you for having. And definitely we'll see you on the conference tour at some point next
Somewhere
year.
out in the circuit. Well, again, thanks for everybody for tuning in. Chris, lastly, how do people reach you, man? What's the best way to get a hold of Chris Henry here?
You can go to freightmath.com, all one word. Scroll to the bottom, sign up to our monthly newsletter,
Okay.
and learn more about us that way. Or you can just reach out to me at Henry, CHENRY, at freightmath.com or KSMTA.com.
Outstanding. Well, you heard it here, guys. Chris Henry. Again, highly encourage everybody that's maybe tuning in or watches the recording to please, if anything, I'm not going to speak for Chris, but I'm sure he'd be willing to take that call and at least get you started and food for thought, if nothing else, where it go from there. So again, thanks everybody for joining in today for another episode of Semi-Related. And I believe we'll probably have another couple episodes before the official end of year, but still in the interim, wishing everybody a safe and relaxing as much as possible holiday season. So Chris, we'll see you soon. Thanks again for everybody tuning in.
Take care.